Though acts of mass violence at schools in America are well known in recent history, from Columbine in 1999, Virginia Tech in 2007, and Sandy Hook in 2012, attacks on schools go much further back in history. Some of you may have seen my video on the Texas Tower sniping in 1966, but that was not the first mass casualty assault on a school. The deadliest attack on a school in the U.S. happened over 30 years earlier, in 1927, in Bath, Michigan. One man, Andrew Kehoe, who held a grudge against the school and school board in Bath, detonated explosives in and near the school, taking the lives of 44 people, most of them young students, and himself. I found out about this bombing in research for my own novel about a fictional school shooting, Tyler's Only Friend, and was surprised I hadn't heard of it before, given the magnitude of the destruction. The bulk of the information in this video comes from a book called Bath Massacre, America's First School Bombing by Arnie Bernstein. I have a link in the description below. Andrew Kehoe was born in 1872 and grew up on a farm in Tecumseh, Michigan, near the Ohio border. Kehoe was the eldest son of an Irish Catholic immigrant, Philip Kehoe, who had fled the Irish potato famine, and his second wife, Mary, also an Irish Catholic immigrant. His father became a successful farmer, won local elections, and participated heavily in the farming community. He had strong views about taxes. He believed taxpayers should dictate and oversee everything that the taxes paid for. As a child, Kehoe had an obsession with electricity and tried to invent electric tools to enhance productivity on the family farm. He was also known for being introverted and liked to be alone. Kehoe's mother developed health problems while he was still young, to the point where she was bedridden for years, and then passed away when Kehoe was about 18. Kehoe's father then married for the third time. Kehoe's new stepmom was younger than him and decades younger than his aging father. Kehoe did not get along with his stepmom and left the family farm. His life during his years away from home are not well known. He did study electrical engineering, a new and growing field in the late 1800s, in St. Louis. While there, he suffered a serious brain injury. Sources vary on what exactly happened. It was possibly caused by an electric shock, possibly by a fall, and he was knocked unconscious. The book says it left him in a coma for 2 weeks, and a relative said he was semi-conscious for 2 months. Later, he worked various jobs related to electricity in the Midwest and then came back home in 1905 to work on the family farm in his early 30s. In 1911, the Kehoe family experienced another tragedy. One day, Kehoe's stepmom attempted to light the stove and a huge fireball erupted, engulfing her in flames. His father, who was now elderly and struggling with arthritis, was unable to help. Kehoe first tried to put the fire out with water, but this only made the fire worse because it was fueled by either oil or gasoline. Eventually, he put out the fire, but his stepmom had severe burns all over and was in extreme pain. He went to a neighbor who had a telephone to call for help. Long after the encounter, the neighbor recalled that when Kehoe asked for help, he was not at all panicked and behaved as if this was all just a minor inconvenience. His stepmom was in such bad shape that the doctor couldn't do anything. A priest administered the last rites, and she passed away. After the school bombing, people began to speculate that this wasn't an accident, given the feud between Kehoe and his stepmom, and that he may have sabotaged the stove. Kehoe married Nellie Price in 1912. They had dated when they were younger until Kehoe moved to St. Louis, then renewed their relationship years later. Nellie was also Irish Catholic, like Kehoe, and she and her family lived in Bath, a small town in central Michigan near the capital of Lansing, where they owned farmland. After marrying, Kehoe and his wife lived in Tecumseh and continued to work on the Kehoe farm. A couple of disputes arose during this time that would foreshadow the later problems in Bath. First, Kehoe and his wife were members of a Catholic church. The parish wanted to build a new church and said everyone had to chip in to pay for it. The Kehoes were supposed to pay $400. A priest visited them to collect the money. Andrew not only refused to pay, but told the priest to get off his property. He never went back to the church and told his wife that she couldn't go back either. Second, Kehoe purchased some livestock from a neighbor. Not long after, 2 of the animals died under Kehoe's care. Believing he had been swindled, he asked the neighbor for a refund greater than the value of the 2 animals. Understandably, the neighbor refused, and Kehoe held a bitter grudge against the neighbor. Philip Kehoe died in 1915, and as the eldest son, Andrew inherited the family farm. Nellie's wealthy uncle died in 1917 and left 80 acres of farmland in Bath that had a house and barn to other relatives. This was the same property that Nellie had grown up on. Kehoe decided to sell his place, buy Nellie's family's property, and move there because the Bath farm had excellent land, a big house, and great views. He ended up selling his family farm to the neighbor he held a grudge against. The neighbor told Kehoe he wanted to purchase the property a few weeks after Kehoe got a real estate agent, which angered him because if the neighbor had told him earlier, he would have skipped the agent's cut of the sale. Somehow, despite the feud and the neighbor's poor timing, Kehoe sold the farm to that neighbor for $8,000. Kehoe then sold the firewood on the land to a different neighbor at a cheap price, because according to Kehoe, the firewood had not been paid for in the sale of his land, and he wasn't going to let the neighbor that he had a grudge against get something for free. Kehoe bought the land in Bath from Nellie's family for $12,000, $6,000 down, with the rest mortgaged. He officially got the land in 1919. In the 1920s, Bath, Michigan was a small farming town with a population of only about 300. However, a railroad ran through the town, where many trains carried goods to and from Lansing, and business from the train station caused the small town to grow rapidly. In 1921, the town decided to build one big school to replace the multitude of one-room schoolhouses in the area. A school board was formed. It created a bus service, purchased buses, and hired bus drivers and teachers. An already existing school building was relocated to a new spot in town, and additional work added to the facility. The school cost $43,000, and a bond was issued. To repay most of the bond over time, property taxes were raised by over $12 per $1,000 in property value. Given Kehoe's valuable property, this raised his taxes a considerable amount. In 1922, the Bath Consolidated School began classes with over 200 students. The Kehoes were a little different from their neighbors in Bath. When the Kehoes moved to Bath, they didn't have a vehicle and had to rent a truck to move their belongings, which included a tractor. At that time, most of the farmers there still relied on farm animals to work their land. But some of their neighbors did have vehicles and would give the Kehoes rides when they needed food or farming supplies. So the Kehoes had the mechanized farm equipment, but not the mechanized transportation. Most in the town came to view Andrew Kehoe as intelligent, polite, and willing to lend a hand when help was needed. However, he was a bit eccentric. When he performed work on the farm, which was, of course, a dirty and smelly job, he dressed in formal business attire, including the shoes. It was a strange sight, a middle-aged man riding a tractor, dressed like he was about to go into a business meeting, even in the middle of summer. He also kept his tools and buildings meticulously clean and organized. And for some reason, Kehoe did not harvest his corn and instead let it go to waste. Andrew was very outspoken about how farmers should conduct their business. Like his father, he thought that farmers should coordinate to influence the supply of crops and therefore the price. He despised other farmers who grew more crops than normal and flooded the market. Because of Kehoe's years of experience working on all things electrical and mechanical, He was able to provide invaluable assistance to other farmers in town with their tools and equipment. Residents grew to respect him for his know-how. He was also very familiar with another aspect of farming, explosives. Back in those days, it was normal for farmers to use dynamite or pyrotol, an explosive used in the military, to clear tree stumps and other obstacles from the land. Kehoe had used explosives back on his farm in Tecumseh and gave advice to others in Bath on how to properly use them. Andrew and Nellie participated in the community. They attended different groups and events, often playing a card game called euchre with others. They had fun playing, but Andrew was a stickler for the rules. Anytime the rules were violated or someone made a mistake, he became very agitated. One other difference they had with the community was that both of them were well into their 40s and didn't have any children. Almost everybody in Bath had kids, and some around Kehoe's age had grandkids. Though they were not shunned for this difference, it was likely a factor in Andrew's future issues with the school board. The school superintendent was a young man named Emery Hike. Hike was a teacher who was eager to improve the quality of education for the community. He worked persistently in trying to get the school accreditation and was successful in 1925. He was well respected in Bath for his efforts. Kehoe, like his father, was very concerned about how his tax dollars were being spent. In fact, he was so concerned that he ran for the school board and won in 1924. He became the treasurer for the board. The board did have some problems with favoritism and nepotism, and his focus on spending tax dollars wisely gained a lot of support in Bath. The school board met regularly, and Hike also attended these meetings because of state laws. The board also thought it was good that he was present for the meetings, except for Kehoe. Kehoe hated that Hike was at every meeting and wanted him barred from attending. To him, Hike was overreaching and trying to exert far too much power over how tax dollars were being spent on the school. They quickly developed a bitter rivalry. Hike continued to attend the meetings, and the feud between Hike and Kehoe only grew worse. Over the next couple of years, they battled over many issues before the board. In general, Hike would support spending money for more resources for the school, and Kehoe would oppose it. Sometimes Kehoe won, and sometimes he lost. When he did lose, he would always want to end the meetings right away, and built a reputation for being highly antagonistic. I'll go over a few of their disputes. Kehoe won an early battle over Hike's compensation, reducing his raise and decreasing his paid time off. But in a later year, Kehoe fought against Hike's raise and lost. Kehoe resisted the purchase of supplies for the school, such as encyclopedias, and tried to stop the bus contract from being awarded to a relative of the school board. When Hike wanted to block the renewal of a teacher's contract because he did not agree with how she taught, Kehoe took the teacher's side and fought to keep her with the school, but the board ultimately sided with Hike. On paydays, Kehoe gave out paychecks to the employees at the school. His memory would always fail when it came to delivering Hike's check. Also, in 1926, a year before the bombing, 2 members who supported Hike were re-elected to the board, in another blow to Kehoe. On the other hand, Kehoe did an excellent job as treasurer and kept detailed and accurate records. His diligent work did garner support from residents, but his intense feud with Hike, which was well known in town, hurt him in the long run. When the township clerk passed away, the local Republican Party asked Kehoe to fill the position, which he did. When the term ended, the local party rejected him as a candidate because of all the headaches he was causing at the school board. Shortly before the bombing, he ran for a different local office, but lost. One other thing that Kehoe did for the board was do maintenance work at the school. As a skilled mechanic, Kehoe fixed the electrical systems, plumbing, floors, and even eliminated a beehive after bees kept stinging children and teachers. With these jobs, Kehoe could enter the school whenever he wanted and grew familiar with its layout, rooms, and basement. Kehoe's potential career in local politics being crushed by electoral defeats was only one aspect of his life that grew worse as the 1920s progressed. In 1926, Kehoe's wife, Nellie, became ill with a series of medical problems that included strong headaches, coughing fits, and weight loss. She had to stay at the hospital multiple times and, when home, couldn't do much. The Kehoes had to hire help. Doctors thought she either had tuberculosis, which was an incurable, often fatal disease at the time, or asthma. Kehoe suffered another head injury when a tree fell on him as he worked on his farm. It caused a lot of bleeding, but he did not fall unconscious for weeks or months, as he had years earlier in St. Louis. The Kehoe's finances were also in trouble. In the early 1920s, they simply stopped paying their mortgage, which was held by the estate of Nellie's dead relative, not a bank. The estate granted them more than one extension and took a very forgiving attitude to the Kehoes, even as they didn't pay for years. Andrew's contentious behavior showed up here, too, and he had a dispute with the estate over money. The estate sometimes had to pay out money to Nellie. In 1926, the estate decided to apply the $500 payment to the Kehoe's mortgage instead of giving Nellie a check. Andrew was not okay with this and contacted a lawyer. Even though Nellie was fine with the money going to the mortgage, Andrew demanded that the $500 go to Nellie, and ultimately, Andrew got his way. Despite the extra money, the Kehoes continued to not pay the mortgage. A little later, the estate attorney contacted police to begin the foreclosure process. The attorney did not have the intention of removing the Kehoes from their farm, only to nudge them into making their payments or making some sort of negotiation. Soon after, the estate attorney who had notified police found out from a relative that Nellie was very ill, changed his mind, and told the police to hold off. However, the Kehoes had already been notified of the foreclosure. Andrew blamed the school tax on his inability to make the payments. A different source said that Kehoe told one of Nellie's relatives regarding the foreclosure that, quote, "If I can't live in that house, no one else will." In the months leading up to the bombing, multiple offers were made to buy the Kehoe property, even though Kehoe had not offered to sell it to anybody. For various reasons, no deal was made. One of the potential buyers backed out due to the high property taxes. Kehoe rejected another offer after he consulted the estate attorney who had asked for the foreclosure. Kehoe seemed uncharacteristically nonchalant about the offers and did not show any ill will toward the attorney for starting the foreclosure process. Kehoe did exhibit cruelty before the attack. His neighbors, the Harts, had a dog that they let run around in their yard, and it liked to bark and bark. Then, one day, the dog disappeared. There are differing accounts on what happened, but they all agree that Kehoe killed the dog, either accidentally or on purpose. One report says that Kehoe told the Harts that the dog had gone onto his property, and he shot it because it annoyed him. Somehow, the neighbors remained on good terms with the Kehoes after the incident. At a different time, Mr. Hart went to visit Kehoe and saw him working a field with his horses. He was very tough and aggressive with them. He forced them to keep going even when they were struggling. One of the horses ended up dying, and Kehoe later told Hart that he should have shot the horse much earlier. Late in 1925, Kehoe asked a neighbor to drive him to a distant town to buy explosives, and Kehoe purchased several £100s of pyritol, plus blasting caps, and told the neighbor it was to remove tree stumps. Though there was nothing unusual about Kehoe buying a lot of explosives, the neighbor did think it was unusual for Kehoe to ask someone to drive far away to buy them, when Kehoe had easier options to get his hands on pyritol. Word spread in Bath that Kehoe had purchased a large amount, and other farmers tried to buy some from Kehoe, but he told them he had used it all. Early in 26, Kehoe bought his own truck and could buy as many explosives as he wanted without relying on someone else. Considering his financial situation and emphasis on reducing expenses, it was a bit out of character. Late in 26, he drove to Lansing several times to buy dynamite, blasting caps, a rifle, and ammunition. On New Year's Eve, people all over Bath heard massive explosions coming from Kehoe's fields. He told a neighbor he had rigged them to go off at midnight. Mr. Hart also noticed that Kehoe would be away from his house on evenings and thought he was just seeing his wife at the hospital. Around April of 27, he noticed boxes in the back of Kehoe's truck and more frequent trips. A few days before the bombing, workers repairing a bridge in the vicinity had a big stash of dynamite disappear. Friends and neighbors noticed wires around Kehoe's farm, and they assumed it had to do with the power lines that linemen were installing nearby. Others noticed more odd things in the weeks and months before the bombing. The school janitor found that one of the exterior doors had damage around the lock, and later the lock wouldn't work. He went to Kehoe, the school handyman, who was unable to fix it and had to send it away to be fixed. Around the same time, the janitor also discovered that trapdoors in the basement would be open, even though he thought he had closed them. Kehoe seemed to become even more irritable and strange, according to those who knew him. He made dark jokes and comments, like saying he was glad that the weather had been poor and hurt farmers' crop yields, and that the paychecks he handed out could be the last ones. He attempted to sell some of his possessions, but stubbornly kept the price high, and most of the time failed to negotiate a deal. He once gave a horse to an acquaintance who didn't want to buy one, and then later gave that acquaintance a bill for more than what the horse was worth. After some back and forth, the acquaintance took the horse back to Kehoe, who bitterly accepted its return. One friend said that he became more quiet and more thoughtful. In the days before the bombing, Kehoe paid off some of his debts, though not the mortgage, again tried and failed to sell his horse, and picked up his wife, whose health had gotten worse, from the hospital. On the evening before the bombing, he told his wife's sister that he had taken Nellie to another town to visit some friends, and then he stopped by the school where there was a PTA meeting. But he did not attend the meeting. He was seen standing in front of the school, in the dark, staring at it. May 18th, 1927. In the morning, Kehoe drove to the train station and shipped a package to the insurance agents involved with the school board. The package listed its contents as high explosives. The local blacksmith approached Kehoe and asked him to look at the malfunctioning well pump in the school. He agreed, and together they took a look at the pump along with the janitor. They couldn't figure out why it wasn't working, but a repairman would be showing up soon. Out of nowhere, Kehoe said he had somewhere to go and abruptly left. The Bath Consolidated School had two wings, north and south. It was 2 stories tall and had a basement. Students at the grade school, middle school, and high school levels attended classes there. Only a couple of days were left before summer break, when students would stay home to help their families on the farms. At 8:45 in the morning, the north wing of the school exploded. A combination of dynamite and pyritol lifted the walls of the north wing 4 feet higher. It then came crashing down, along with the roof, which collapsed and sent crumbling debris onto the floors below. Survivors said that the floor jumped up several feet as if caught in an earthquake, and second-floor classrooms fell onto classrooms below. The principal was in a nearby church. The blast caused the pews to fall over. Hike, who had already given notice that he was stepping down from his superintendent position, was in the school at the time. He felt the floors and walls shake. The well pump mechanic and janitor were in the basement. The explosion threw them back, but they survived. The boilers in the basement broke their mounts and fell down. The shockwave blew out windows in nearby houses. The thunderous boom traveled miles. The sound, combined with the giant cloud of dust, alerted Bath residents that something had happened at the school. Some thought it may have been the boilers exploding. At the same time the school bomb detonated, gunshots were heard at Kehoe's farm. Shortly thereafter, smoke and flames appeared from all of the structures on his property. Mr. Hart, the neighbor, knew Kehoe was responsible. Linemen who were installing power lines nearby rushed to the Kehoe farm and entered the burning house. They didn't hear anybody inside, so they decided to remove furniture in order to save it from going up in flames, along with some dynamite they found inside. As the fire further consumed the buildings on the farm, the linemen and neighbors who were arriving saw it was a lost cause and headed to the school to help. Back at the school, students could be heard stuck in the pile of debris. One exterior wall of the north wing was still standing, and most of the roof had fallen down. Some of the deceased lay on school grounds. A number of students had made it onto the roof and wanted to jump off. Hike made his way onto the roof too, and tried to convince the students not to jump, while calling out to others to get ladders. Many students did jump from windows, sustaining injuries when they landed. The janitor and mechanic moved from the basement to the first floor on the south wing, which had not sustained major damage. The students there had followed fire drill procedures and formed a line. The janitor and mechanic led the students out of the building. By this time, people from all around Bath had either heard the explosion or heard from others that the school needed help and were showing up in droves. An impromptu rescue and recovery operation began as farmers, business owners, mechanics, school officials, and survivors rushed to pull victims from what was left of the school. The injured and the dead were laid out on the lawn. About 230 to 275 students had been inside when it happened. Many of the people who responded had children there. Parents desperately searched, even pulling up the blankets of the deceased to find them. Some cried out in anguish when they found out their child had passed. The lucky ones were relieved to find their kid had survived. The blacksmith found his daughter alive. Some of the injured were taken to nearby homes, which turned into makeshift emergency rooms. Anything available was used for the effort: beds, sheets, cots, vehicles, rope. Even a spare telephone pole was brought in to pry up heavy beams. Cars raced away from the scene, carrying the wounded to Lansing. Women prepared food for the men clearing the wreckage. Several trapped students were rescued. A few trapped students, once the rescuers cleared the rubble around them, jumped up and sprinted away from the building, seemingly unharmed. A teenage girl worked at the telephone bank in town. She called as many towns as quickly as she could, letting them know what happened and requesting help. Hike made his way there and called agencies, including the state police and State Department. The fire department in Lansing sent resources, including communications equipment. Their response time was 12 minutes. More neighbors showed up at Kehoe's farm, but by this time, everything was covered in flames. Out of the heat and billowing smoke, they saw a pickup pull towards them. Kehoe was driving. Looking like he was on a mission, he told them that they were his friends and they should go to the school. He then left, heading right towards the school. Numerous people that morning saw Kehoe driving his truck on the way from his farm to the scene of devastation. Kehoe even smiled and waved to one of them. The lineman, who had been in Kehoe's house, approached the school when his truck came barreling towards them. They had to jump out of the way to avoid it. Kehoe stopped his truck near the rubble about 30 minutes after the blast. He asked Hike to come over, and probably knew that Hike was no longer going to be the superintendent. Although the detonations at Kehoe's farm could be heard around the school, it is not believed that Hike knew Kehoe's property was burning. Witnesses have conflicting accounts about what exactly happened next. Hike told Kehoe that his truck could transport supplies for the rescue effort. Kehoe said, "I'll take you with me." Hike realized that Kehoe was involved as Kehoe pulled a gun and fired it into his own truck. Some accounts state that Hike struggled with Kehoe before the gun went off, and still others said he didn't use a gun but hit a switch. The scene was chaotic, and the witnesses had a lot of things to focus on. Either way, Kehoe set off dynamite that he had placed in his truck, creating another explosion, this time of metal and gasoline. The truck had been filled with scrap metal, tools, nails, and bolts. These, along with pieces of the truck, became shrapnel that shot outward and into the survivors and responders. The blast immediately killed Kehoe, Hike, and another man. A fourth man suffered grievous wounds. Shrapnel hit many more, including students who had survived the first bombing, and a woman who was down the street. A group of men dragging a telephone pole for the rescue efforts were knocked over. The book goes into gruesome detail in describing the carnage wrought by both explosions. Human remains littered the area, and heartbreaking scenes of death and mourning unfolded. Items and remains were hanging from telephone lines. Only the engine and part of the frame of Kehoe's truck were left. Somebody was seen collecting remains to keep as souvenirs. The smell was horrendous. Some of the responders had served in the Great War as medics, and what they saw reminded them of the aftermath of battle. Word traveled to the people just coming onto the scene that this was no accident. Kehoe was responsible. More and more people kept showing up. Medics, local police, state police, firefighters, doctors, nurses, factory workers, students from Michigan State College, farmers, construction workers, students who attended the school and were not in the building during the blast, the Red Cross, the sheriff, the county prosecutor, the National Guard, high-ranking officials from the Michigan Department of Public Safety, a fire chief, reporters, tourists who wanted to see for themselves, and, in the afternoon, the governor of Michigan. So many vehicles filled the roads heading to Bath that a massive traffic jam developed. The traffic made it difficult to evacuate the wounded out of town. Ambulances and private cars that did make it out overwhelmed a hospital in Lansing, where they had to triage the victims. Parents, searching for their children in the improvised morgue next to the school, discovered a couple of the students under sheets were still alive. One of them was evacuated in a hearse because there were no more ambulances, so that child had been put under a sheet in a morgue and then put in a hearse. A fire chief had been in the basement searching for the cause of the first explosion and did not hear the truck detonate. Someone told him about it, and he helped the victims. Outside, he was given dynamite found at Kehoe's farm. The worker at the railway station informed the chief and other officials about the box Kehoe had shipped earlier to the insurance agent. The agent would be notified. Red Cross volunteers found Kehoe's remains in a ditch with his driver's license still on him. The sheriff brought people who knew Kehoe to the remains, and there was enough left for them to recognize the man responsible. The blacksmith found Hike's remains. 2 officers looking through debris in the school basement found dynamite connected to a wire. Fearing a third explosion, all work on the school was paused at 10:45, 2 hours after the first. A group of officials, police officers, and an engineer went into the basement to investigate. They followed the wire into a pipe that was full of dynamite. Then they discovered more dynamite, pyrrolitol, wires, blasting caps, car batteries, and clocks. The basement under both wings held these components, and everything was connected as if ready to explode. Nobody else had noticed them before May 18th because Kehoe had hidden them. The basement had a complex layout with many cracks, crevices, equipment, corners, hard-to-reach places, and was very poorly lit. Kehoe also had installed construction materials, like plaster, along the ceiling to hold and hide explosives, and would have had to use a pole to shove dynamite down into some of these places. Some of the materials had been down there for a long time, as the staples anchoring the wires had rusted. With great care and patience, officers slowly removed the materials from the basement. However, some of the explosives were tucked into places too tight for grown men to access. A 14-year-old boy who had previously dropped out of the school volunteered, made it through the narrow spaces, and removed the rest. The combined weight of the recovered explosives was about 500 pounds, and it's believed 100 pounds had detonated in the school. If all of it had gone off at the same time, the whole building would have collapsed, and the estimated death toll would have been 150 higher, or about 200 dead. It's not known why the 500 pounds failed to go off. One theory says that some part, like a wire or blasting cap, failed, and another says that Kehoe made an error in how he set up the components. Either way, when Kehoe drove his truck up to the school for the last time, he must have recognized that only a fraction of what he had planted had worked, as the south wing was still standing. The fires and occasional explosions had, despite firefighting efforts, decimated Kehoe's farm. Almost nothing was left standing. Similar to the school basement, Kehoe had fashioned a system of timers, wires, dynamite, and gasoline to thoroughly destroy everything on his property. An unexploded incendiary device full of gasoline and straw was found in his chicken coop. But Kehoe went further than that. He had damaged his trees, cut his grapevines, but covered up the damage, and, in another act of cruelty, restrained his horses so they couldn't get out of the burning barn. Kehoe had attached a sign to his fence which read, quote, "Criminals are made, not born." Later, the insurance agent was notified before Kehoe's package arrived, and the package was safely located. An extra telegraph line was installed at the telephone bank to carry news out to the rest of the world. Major newspapers in the region sent reporters, photographers, and airplanes. Residents saw planes landing in farm fields and flying over the school to take pictures and bring them back for publishing. One newspaper in Chicago was able to publish a story later in the evening, and so was one in Lansing, which named Kehoe. Back in those days, newsreels were played in movie theaters. The news ended up moving so fast that one day later, newsreels taken in Bath were showing before movies in major cities. Drawings of Kehoe were also made in newspapers, depicting Kehoe as ugly and menacing, with a pig-like nose and empty eyes, not even close to his actual appearance of a decent-looking middle-aged man with gray hair. After hearing the news, Nellie's sisters met up with the estate attorney in Lansing to find Nellie. They drove to the family friends that Kehoe had said Nellie would be staying at, but Nellie hadn't been there. They then traveled to Bath, and after fighting traffic, still couldn't find her. The search for survivors in the ruins of the school continued throughout the day and night when lights were hauled in. One rescuer, after working in a section, said out loud that they were done with that area. In response, 2 girls trapped below began screaming. When the governor showed up in the afternoon, he joined in removing the debris. The enormous traffic jam of disaster tourists around Bath did not end when the sun went down, and headlights lit up the night. At least one family was not able to get to the funeral home to stay with their dead son due to the backup. Over the night, no more victims were found in the ruins, dead or alive. Belongings found there were returned to the owner or to grieving parents. Prayer vigils were held on school grounds. Law enforcement spread all over Bath to search for any more explosives, but did not find any. Police officers taking a smoke break discovered Nellie's remains on the farm the next day. They were near a makeshift wheelbarrow. They were so damaged and burned that the cause of death was impossible to determine, though the family, investigators, and the news believed that Andrew had hit her with a blunt object. A box containing important documents, like their marriage certificate and hospital bills, some from a hospital in Lansing that had treated victims of the attack, rested near the remains. The package that Kehoe had mailed was opened, slowly, but only contained a short letter and accounting documents. Kehoe's letter said that he wouldn't be working for the school board anymore and explained a discrepancy of 23 cents between his books and the bank records. Vehicle traffic from morbid tourists only got worse. Roads backed up for miles and miles. Police had to be detailed to direct all the traffic. Some of the tourists chased ambulances and police cars. It took hours for the Red Cross to arrive from Lansing, a city that was close by. The bombs had gone off on a Wednesday, and by Sunday, tens of thousands of vehicles were seen in Bath or trying to get into Bath on roads that had become parking lots. People left their cars to go sightsee on Kehoe's farm, flocking to where Nellie's body had been found, despite the chance that more explosives could still be hidden. Some of these tourists showed a serious lack of respect when it came time for the funerals. The heavy traffic made lots of loud sounds. They formed crowds outside of funeral services, watched hearses on their journeys, went to cemeteries to sightsee burials and the graves of the children, made attempts to see the dead by looking through windows, or even directly asking residents to see their dead family members. There were so many funerals that there was a shortage of funeral homes, grave diggers, pallbearers, and priests. Bath citizens volunteered to be pallbearers, sometimes for multiple funerals, as many would-be pallbearers had either perished or were in the hospital. Funerals had to be scheduled to allow families to attend each other's services to offer support. The never-ending traffic caused mourners to be late to services. The local reverend missed most of these services because his 8-year-old daughter lost her life in the explosion. A minister brought in from another city couldn't finish his sermon because he was weeping. One reporter for a newspaper in Lansing wrote a story about the funeral for her own son. Police tried to keep the tourists at bay and did provide transportation for some of the funeral workers. Eventually, officials told the state police to end the circus. Officers went around ordering people to leave. However, increased traffic would plague Bath for months. Nellie Kehoe was laid to rest in a Catholic ceremony in Lansing with a large group of mourners. Reporters and photographers followed them, tempers flared, and the mourners and photographers almost came to blows. Without ceremony, Andrew Kehoe's remains were buried in the pauper section of a different cemetery. Grave diggers dug multiple holes, placed the remains in one, and filled them all up. Kehoe's name did not mark the location. This was all done to prevent anyone from digging up his remains. No one attended the burial. A few relatives and friends drove into the cemetery by the grave, did not get out of their cars, and then left. Every school board member had lost children or had people close to them lose children. The first school board meeting after the disaster was 2 days later and was a somber event. The board still owed tens of thousands on the school that had just been destroyed and had almost no money. They appointed a new superintendent to replace Hike and a new treasurer to replace Kehoe. The governor publicly appealed for people and businesses to donate to the relief efforts, including the cost of building a new school. Donations came in from all over. Even children and prisoners contributed what they could. Fundraising events were held around the country. A Michigan senator, James Couzens, who had made a fortune as an early investor in Henry Ford's company, said he would give as much money as needed for the victims and their families. The governor said he'd pay for the funerals of any children whose families did not have the means with his own money. The local prosecutor quickly set up an investigation of the events. Jurors were selected from those who came to help on the day of the bombing. All of them were men chosen because they did not have children, so their minds would be less clouded by grief. Dozens of witnesses testified, and jurors examined physical evidence. They concluded that Kehoe acted alone, planted all of the explosives, destroyed the school, his own property, his own truck, killed his wife, and declared him sane due to his efforts to hide the construction of his bombs and hide his intentions. They also did not find the janitor or school board to be negligent in failing to find Kehoe's preparations. Most chalked up his motivations to a hatred of paying high taxes, like his father had, and the foreclosure on his property. The sign he had hung on his fence seemed to suggest this, blaming outside forces on his actions. A lot of events affected Bath and the memory of the tragedy over the following weeks, months, years, and decades. The attack was the lead story in newspapers everywhere for only 2 days. On May 20th, Charles Lindbergh flew his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, from New York and landed in Paris the next day. His journey captivated the news worldwide, and though not famous beforehand, Lindbergh became an instant media sensation. I looked up the New York Times for that date, and Lindbergh was on the first page. The Bath disaster was on page 3. Shortly after that, a powerful earthquake struck China, and thousands died. With these events, the Bath disaster was mostly forgotten outside of Michigan. During the summer, Bath continued to endure hardship. Tourists kept stopping by, stealing items from the Kehoe land, and gawking at the school ruins. The KKK sent around flyers blaming the incident on Kehoe's Catholicism. Letters poured in from different states and countries, some offering condolences, others blaming the people of Bath. In July and August, over 200 more pounds of dynamite were discovered in the debris along with wood shavings. Several children who had been hospitalized with serious injuries recovered. One boy, who doctors said would not make it to 15, not only defied expectations, but lived to see the 21st century. The last victim to lose their life passed away in August, 4 months later. In total, 45 people died from the disaster, 37 children and 2 teachers in the school, 1 child and 4 adults from the truck, and Nellie Kehoe at the farm. Most of the children were in the 3rd to 6th grades, ages 8 to 12. About 14% of the school lost their lives, and 58 people were injured. In the next school year, classes were held in various places in Bath, such as the firehouse, stores, and homes. The wealthy Michigan senator ultimately paid for a new school building at the same location, which recycled sections from the damaged school. Bomb threats were made on the school in the 60s and 70s. Responders combing through the building for explosives noticed damage to the rafters and basement from 1927. They never found any bombs. The building was demolished in 1975. The process began on the anniversary, May 18th. Kehoe's land went back to Nellie's family, who donated it to a Catholic organization. It was later sold to a farmer who began using the land again. The chimney and other debris remained on the land for many years. Rumors persisted that Kehoe had buried dynamite on the land, but nothing was ever found. Some of the boys who survived the bombing would go on to serve in World War II. In 1977, survivors returned on the 50th anniversary. The principal from the day of the disaster and Hike's widow attended. In 1985, the Bath School Museum was created. In 1995, after the Oklahoma City bombing, reporters flocked to Bath to compare the two tragedies. A few survivors made it into their 90s and were alive for the 80th anniversary in 2007, 1 month after the active shooting at Virginia Tech. In 2022, 95 years after the disaster, Irene Dunham, who witnessed the disaster, died at the age of 114. She was the oldest person in Michigan when she passed. She had been a senior at the time and missed school due to illness, but heard the explosion. Irene and her mom went to the school and saw the carnage up close. She knew Kehoe and said, quote, "He talked to all of us girls like we were okay, just before he did what he did." The site where the Bath Consolidated School once stood is now a memorial park. A plaque listing the names of those who perished does not include Andrew and Nellie Kehoe. The 100th anniversary will be coming up in 2027. The source for most of the information comes from the book Bath Massacre, which I've linked below. I found newspaper articles online for supplemental sources. On some details, the sources do vary. I tried to go with the book as much as possible. The book briefly covers what may have driven Kehoe to commit such a heinous act. On the more surface level, Kehoe was immensely upset that he had to pay such high property taxes, which went to the school, and the estate had started foreclosure proceedings on his property. These more ordinary problems don't explain the mass violence, and the book links Kehoe's behavior to the traits of a psychopath, one with no empathy, no remorse, lack of self-control, manipulative behavior, surface-level charisma, and the ability to appear perfectly normal and reasonable while plotting or committing terrible crimes. Outside of the book, FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole has identified Andrew Kehoe as an injustice collector, which is a type of person who is an extreme grudge holder. They keep grudges over minor slights or wrongs made against them for extended periods of time. Injustice collector is not an official diagnosis, but comes from the FBI's research into school attackers, where they kept finding perpetrators who liked to keep running tallies of every little thing everybody did to wrong them, including times when they just believed that someone had wronged them, even if it was accidental. Eventually, they decide to exact revenge for their years of mistreatment, and a small number of injustice collectors take the revenge to extreme, violent levels. I have the link to the article below. Kehoe exhibited signs of being both a psychopath and an injustice collector. On the psychopath side, Kehoe showed signs of cruelty and callousness. Kehoe had a shocking lack of empathy when his stepmother was fatally burned, as his neighbor reported him acting calm and casual when he asked for help. There is also the possibility that he sabotaged the stove to malfunction and burn her, in which case Kehoe had no remorse for his actions, along with a lack of empathy. Some residents pointed out that if Kehoe's problem was with the school and taxes, he could have timed everything to go off during the night, when nobody was in the school, and simply destroyed property. Instead, he rigged it for the morning of a school day. Kehoe was also cruel to animals in several situations, another element of psychopathy, and though his behavior had a darker tint in the months before the bombing, he did a good enough job of acting as if nothing was wrong while filling the school basement with explosives. One psychopathic trait Kehoe did not have was a lack of self-control. Kehoe spent months, and possibly more than a year, planning and setting up his day of attack. It's not known when Kehoe started building his devices, but the rusty staples and sheer volume of dynamite had to have taken time and patience to plant. If I had to guess, I think when he bought his truck early in 1926, giving him the ability to buy and transport dynamite on his own was his point of no return. There was nothing impulsive about his actions. There were clear signs that Kehoe was an injustice collector. He nursed a bitter feud with his stepmom that lasted over a decade. It started when he was a young man, then he left the family for schooling and various jobs, and came back in his 30s, and they still didn't get along. And then he wasn't bothered when she suffered deadly burns. Of course, he had the long-running rivalry with Hike, the superintendent, because he believed Hike was taking advantage of the school board. Kehoe held harsh feelings toward Hike for years, all the way to the bitter end when he called him over to his truck. Kehoe blamed the school tax for his financial problems, and eventually he got his disproportionate revenge on the school, attempting to annihilate the whole building that his taxpayer dollars were going to. He likely felt extra bitter because he wasn't getting any benefit from the school, as he had no children. Kehoe's injustice collecting was so severe he harbored bitter feelings every time something didn't go his way. When some livestock he bought died, he demanded compensation. When his church wanted money, he cut off contact. When his wife's estate applied a payment to the mortgage, he fought to stop it. When someone broke the rules in a card game, he lost his temper. When he sold his property, he made sure to sell his firewood so the buyer, who had sold him the livestock, couldn't get it for free. When other farmers sold a big harvest, he despised them. When things didn't go his way at the school board meeting, he tried to shut it down, and when he couldn't keep his house, he destroyed it. Kehoe was also facing multiple personal crises before the attack. This is something I saw in other rampage killers I researched. For example, job loss, losing a custody battle, divorce, or financial ruin. Kehoe had serious problems in his life leading up to May 18th. His wife was sick and getting sicker to the point where she couldn't do much. If she did have tuberculosis, she likely would have died from it, and Nellie was the only person Kehoe was close to in Bath. The book mentions that he had no close friends, only casual friends or neighbors he traded favors with, and his testy reputation was well known in town. His financial situation was dire, which was partially his own fault. He didn't harvest his own corn, I'm guessing out of some warped reasoning on keeping crop supply low to give more power to farmers in the market, which reduced his income, and he didn't pay his mortgage for years. Nellie's illness brought in more medical bills, and they had to pay someone to help with the chores. But his finances weren't a complete loss. The estate attorney didn't want to just kick him off the land. He was willing to work out a deal where Kehoe could sell the property and keep the equity. The other failure in his life was his political career, which Kehoe himself sunk by getting into the feud with Hike. This was another source of potential income lost. Kehoe might have believed he had no way out of these problems. Even if he hadn't made any bombs and never hurt anyone, he likely would have had to sell his property, move to a much smaller place. His wife probably would have passed away, and he'd have to sell a lot of his assets to stay afloat. Though he had failed in practically every endeavor, with his handyman skills and farming experience, he could have found more work and kept advocating for the strict oversight of taxpayer funds. His life wasn't over. On the other hand, I've read about rampage killers who endured far less hardship than Kehoe did and still went ballistic. While reading the book, I was a bit surprised that he didn't do anything drastic for years as his life continued to go downhill. The last major point I have about this case is the brain trauma. I noticed this trend during the early stages of researching for my book, and the more I look, the more cases I find of killers with previous brain trauma. Not much is known about his accident while he was away from home as a young man, but the reports depict a severe case of brain trauma from either an electric shock or a fall. Considering there is little info on what he was doing when he was away from home for all those years, I can't get a sense of how much the event changed him, if any. The people best positioned to tell were his stepmom, father, and wife, who knew him before the accident and lived with him after it, but they all died before or during the disaster. This sounds like a case where we will never know how much of a role the brain trauma played. I have a few smaller points. Kehoe was one of the oldest rampage killers I found. Most of them were in their teens, 20s, or maybe 30s. In 1927, he was in his mid-50s, old enough to be a grandfather, married for more than a decade, and over double the age of Charles Whitman, the subject of my previous deep dive video when he climbed the tower at the University of Texas. As men age, they tend to be less likely to commit violence, but Kehoe defied the trend. I couldn't find any instance of him being violent when he was younger. Assuming he did kill his stepmom, he was still about 40 when that happened. The constant barrage of tourists infesting Bath after the tragedy reminded me of Columbine. After the school shooting there, tourism companies set up bus routes to transport tourists to the high school so they could look and take pictures. And when I read that newspapers drew Kehoe as evil and ugly, I thought of the 1996 Port Arthur massacre in Australia. Some newspapers manipulated images of the shooter so he looked more aggressive and menacing. It amazed me how the same patterns showed up decades later, one in a different state and another on a different continent. I never heard about this disaster until I started doing research for my first novel, Tyler's Only Friend. Though I knew plenty about more recent acts of mass murder, like Columbine, Virginia Tech, and the Oklahoma City bombing, I had assumed they were a recent trend, a product of modern technology and cultural changes. Reading about Bath helped to change my view on this. When I was younger, the word Columbine was a verb because it was so universally known, And yet nobody even brought up Bath, a far deadlier attack on a school with the added horror of Kehoe's follow-up truck bomb. The Columbine shooters had built bombs to detonate in the school with additional ones in their cars to harm first responders, just like Kehoe had, except their bombs failed. If all the bombs went off as planned in Columbine, hundreds would have been killed. And if everything that Kehoe had planted had detonated, hundreds would have been killed in Bath. I'm sure the Charles Lindbergh flight did have a big effect on limiting Bath's infamy, along with more limited technology to spread the word. The Bath disaster did have a big effect on me, though. I realized there was a lot more to rampage killings than is commonly understood, and it motivated me to find those types of crimes, ones that captured so much attention during their time, but are now mostly forgotten. Thank you for watching. Any feedback is appreciated. I have links to my novel, Tyler's Only Friend, about an active shooting at a party committed by a college student below, along with sources. I have a lot more videos on my channel covering what I found in my research.